The assembly rooms at Holwick had not changed in the 2 years she was gone. The candles still burned in their iron brackets along the eastern wall, and the musicians still positioned themselves at the top of the stairs with that particular air of professional indifference that made one feel observed without being seen. The floor was the same pale oak, the curtains the same faded crimson, the long tables still arranged along the west side to display the county's daughters at their most carefully poised angles. None of it had changed. The room changed the moment she walked through the door. She felt it before she saw it. The particular quality of silence that descends when a thing no one expected appears in a place it had been formerly excised from. A silence that was not absence of sound, but presence of held breath. Heads turned in that slow, almost involuntary way, the way a flock of birds will orient to a sound before deciding whether to flee. Fans paused mid-flutter, paused. Conversations completed their current syllables and then simply stopped. Margaret kept her chin level. She had practiced that. 2 years of practicing exactly how high to hold her head without allowing it to appear that she had practiced at all. She wore dove gray, as she had every evening for the past 2 years, though the gown was better made now than anything she had owned when she last stood in this county. The mourning period had long since concluded by law, but she had kept the gray. It suited her purposes. The room could make of it whatever it wished. Lady Dorothea Holt stood at the far end of the room near the fireplace, surrounded by the usual arrangement of county matrons who had always orbited her as satellites orbit something large and cold. She was in deep purple tonight, a color that had always been her declaration of authority, and her diamonds caught the candlelight with the practiced ease of things that have spent decades catching light in rooms exactly like this one. She saw Margaret at the same moment the rest of the room did. The fan did not pause. Lady Dorothea's fan continued its steady rhythm, and she leaned toward the woman at her left shoulder, a Mrs. Cresswell of Holwick Park, and said something low and deliberate behind the fan's edge, the kind of thing said at precisely the volume that carries to those it is intended to wound. "A widow with debts and delusions," she said, "returning to a county that had the good sense to be finished with her." Margaret heard it. She was meant to hear it. She crossed the room at a measured pace, toward the refreshment table, and did not look at Lady Dorothea at all. Her eyes swept the room with the calm attention of someone cataloging exits. That was when she saw him. He stood near the terrace door, which was unusual because the night was cold, and the door was cracked open behind him, and he was the only person in the room who appeared to have no interest whatsoever in her arrival. He was tall, with the still, contained quality of a man who has learned to make himself take up very little emotional space despite his physical height. Navy coat, white cravat, no ornamentation. A narrow scar at his left temple that caught the candlelight at a certain angle. His eyes were gray, and they were not looking at her. They had been looking at her. She was certain of that. They were not looking at her now. Edward Hale, Viscount Vere, the Crown's appointed judicial examiner for 3 counties in the north of England, held a glass of claret he had not touched and gazed with apparent studied interest at a small watercolor landscape on the wall near the terrace door. It was not a distinguished painting. Margaret reached the refreshment table, took a glass she did not want, and understood that the reason she had come to this assembly tonight was already standing across the room pretending to admire indifferent landscape art. She had not come back to make an entrance. She had come back to win. The county did not know that yet. It would. It would help to know where the beginning was. Because the story that brought Margaret Vane back to the Holwick assembly rooms did not begin with her arrival through those double doors. It began on a Tuesday in November, 2 winters past, when a footman she had known for 3 years declined to meet her eyes as he informed her that Lady Dorothea had instructed the household that Mrs. Vane's rooms were to be cleared by Thursday. She was not yet dressed. She was standing in the corridor outside the blue sitting room in her dressing gown, holding a cup of tea that had already gone cold. She had been married to Mr. Thomas Vane for 11 months when he died. He was 31. He died of a fever that arrived without warning on a Wednesday and concluded him by the following Sunday. And the speed of it was the cruelest part, the way it left no time for preparation or for farewell of any decent length. The fever also left no time for Thomas to set in order the things he had meant to set in order. This was what Lady Dorothea had been waiting for. This was, Margaret later understood, what Lady Dorothea had always been waiting for. The estate at Holt Park was entailed to a male heir, and in the absence of one, it passed to a nephew, one Mr. Archibald Holt, who was then 42, and who had been standing at the edge of the family's concern for years, with the patient attentiveness of a man who knows that what he wants is only a death away. What Lady Dorothea had argued, with precision and with documents she had assembled with uncommon speed for someone in mourning, was that Thomas had not, in fact, completed the relevant legal instruments that would have secured Margaret's jointure. There was a provision. There was a signature missing. There was a solicitor's letter of a particular date that could be read, in a certain light, to suggest that the marriage settlement had never been properly witnessed. Margaret had her own solicitor. He was 64 and conscientious, and he told her, with evident regret, that fighting the Holt family's claim in Chancery would require money she did not have, and time that the county's social machinery would not extend to her. He told her she should take what Lady Dorothea was offering, which was the return of her own personal effects and £200, and she should go to her sister in Shropshire and be grateful. She took the £200. She did not go to Shropshire. She went first to her father's old friend in London, a retired barrister named Mr. Peel, who owed her father a favor of sufficient age to have become guilt-shaped. Mr. Peel reviewed her documents. He did not tell her she had a weak case. He told her she had a case that needed to find the correct door. The correct door, as it turned out, was the office of the Crown's Judicial Examiner for matters pertaining to contested entails and disputed estate settlements in the northern counties, a post that had been created 3 years prior, specifically because Parliament had grown tired of Chancery's delays in resolving precisely these kinds of disputes. The office sat in a narrow building in York, and the man who occupied it was who had held the post for 2 years and who had, in Mr. Peel's estimation, the temperament of a judge and the patience of someone who had stopped expecting people to surprise him. Margaret wrote to him in January. He did not reply. She wrote again in February. His secretary replied to say that petitions of this nature required submission in the prescribed form, which she had not used. She obtained the prescribed form. She submitted it in March. In April, she received a letter informing her that her petition had been received and would be reviewed in due course. In June, she arrived in York in person. Lord Vere's anteroom contained 4 other petitioners, a clerk at a high desk, and a small window that looked out on a grey courtyard. She waited 2 hours. She was shown in. He was standing behind his desk when she entered, which surprised her. She had expected him to be seated, which was a posture of authority, of deliberate distance. Standing suggested he had been moving, that he had been in the process of something, that her arrival had interrupted a thing in motion. He was tall enough that the ceiling of the office was not generous, and he held himself in a way that suggested long practice at making height seem less commanding than it was. "Mrs. Vane," he said. His voice was even, the syllables precisely measured, as if he rationed them. "Lord Vere," she said, and sat in the chair before he indicated she should, which she did deliberately, because she had learned that small acts of composure in uncomfortable rooms conveyed something that apology never could. He studied her for a moment. She did not look away. "Your petition concerns Holt Park," he said. "The Vane estate in the Northern Riding." "It does." "You contend that the current occupant's claim is invalid on grounds that the settlement dispute raised by Lady Holt was manufactured from a document she herself caused to be undated." "I contend that, and I can demonstrate it, if given the opportunity." He sat. He opened the folder before him, which she recognized as her own petition. He read a passage she could not see. He closed it. "The Holt family," he said, "is not without influence in this county." "No," she agreed. "They are not." He looked at her then, and there was something in it she could not immediately name. It was not sympathy. It was not the professional assessment she had expected. It was something closer to attention, the particular quality of attention given to an unexpected thing. She held herself very still and did not reach for it. "I will review the documentation," he said. "You will receive a written determination within 30 days. "I have been receiving written determinations for 6 months," she said. "They have not yet determined anything." The smallest thing happened at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. Not quite. She filed it away. "Come back on Thursday," he said. "Bring the original marriage register entry, the one from the parish at Caldwell Beck." She had the marriage register entry. She had carried it with her from London. She had known before she sat down that it would be the thing he asked for. If there was a moment she understood that he was not simply going through the procedural motions of review, it was not the morning he came to the mill village of Ashby Cross on what he described to his secretary as a survey visit to assess the condition of contested estate holdings in the district. It was not the afternoon he spent walking the eastern boundary of Holt Park's outer fields, accompanied only by his steward. It was not even the morning when he paused outside the village lending library and spent a full minute examining the notice board before moving on. It was the afternoon she did not know he was there. The lending library at Ashby Cross was managed by a woman named Mrs. Pierce, who had been housekeeper at Holt Park for 20 years before Lady Dorothea replaced her in the first month after Thomas's death. Mrs. Pierce now ran the library from a room behind her sister's cottage, which meant the library was cramped and the collection was idiosyncratic and the hours were irregular. But it was used by most of the village because Mrs. Pierce herself was trusted absolutely by everyone who had ever known her. It was the lending library where Margaret, on a Tuesday afternoon in September, found Eliza. Eliza was 17 and had been a kitchen maid at Holt Park, and she was weeping in the small corridor outside the reading room because she had been accused, that morning, by the new housekeeper Lady Dorothea had installed, of taking a silver spoon that had gone missing from the kitchen inventory. Eliza had not taken anything. The spoon had simply been placed in the wrong drawer during a reorganization. The new housekeeper had been insistent, and Eliza had been dismissed without a character reference, and without a character reference she could not obtain another position, and without a position she could not contribute to the keeping of her mother, who was unwell. Margaret was at the library to return 2 volumes and retrieve 1. She was not in any official capacity. She had no standing in this village in any formal sense. She sat down beside Eliza and listened to the whole of it, and then she stood up and walked to Holt Park herself. She did not go to the front door. She went to the kitchen entrance, which she knew because she had lived in that house for 11 months, and she asked to speak to the new housekeeper. And when the woman appeared, Margaret said very quietly the names of 3 witnesses to the kitchen inventory reorganization who she had established in 4 minutes of conversation with the boot boy she had encountered on the path, and she said that the accusation against Eliza would be withdrawn and a neutral character letter written by the end of the day, or she would take what she knew to his office in York. The character letter was delivered to Eliza's mother's cottage by 5 o'clock. What Margaret had not known was that he had arrived at Holt Park that afternoon on a scheduled visit to inspect the disputed estate inventory, and that he had been standing in the upper hallway near the kitchen stair, conferring with the steward, when he heard her voice in the passage below. He had not descended. He had stood very still for the duration of the exchange, and then he had continued his conversation with the steward, and he had said nothing about it that afternoon. He said nothing about it the following morning either. When Margaret presented herself at his temporary offices in the village inn, as she had done every other Thursday since he had begun his review. He reviewed the new documents she had brought, asked his customary precise questions, and dispatched her with his customary courteous neutrality. When she reached the door of the inn's small conference room, he said, without looking up from the papers before him, "Miss Harlowe's kitchen maid obtained her character letter. I understand?" She paused at the door. "She did." "Good," he said in exactly the tone one uses when something is merely confirmed as expected. Then, after a brief pause that was too deliberate to be accidental, "I'm told the inventory reorganization was poorly supervised." "It was," she said. She left. She stood outside on the village lane in the autumn cold and held herself very still for a moment before she walked on, because her hands had done something embarrassing inside her gloves. The harvest assembly at the Holwick Rooms fell in the second week of October, and it was there that the dismissive label was voiced for the second time in the public register that left no ambiguity about its intent. Lady Dorothea arrived with the full complement of her household's portable consequence, with her nephew at her right hand, a polished Miss Linton of Linton Court at her left, and behind them the organized weight of county opinion that had been accumulating behind her for 2 years. She did not approach Margaret directly. That was not her method. She waited until the room had reached its fullest density, its most attentive configuration, and then she said to Mrs. Caro of the Assembly Committee, at a volume calibrated to the room's acoustics, "One does not understand what she hopes to accomplish here. The woman who could not hold what little she was given ought perhaps to be content with the result." Mrs. Caro looked at the floor. The 2 young women standing nearest Lady Dorothea looked with studied attention at the middle distance. The statement landed in the way such statements were designed to land, not as an accusation, but as a verdict delivered by someone confident enough of their authority to issue verdicts in public rooms without apparent concern for appeal. Margaret, standing near the refreshment table, heard it. She turned toward the window. Outside, the lane was dark and wet. She kept her face composed. What she noticed, because she noticed everything now, was that he, who had been speaking with a county magistrate at the far end of the room, had stopped speaking. He had not looked at Lady Dorothea. He had not looked at Margaret. He was looking at the magistrate with unchanged expression. He had stopped speaking, mid-sentence, and his hand had stilled on the glass he held, and the magistrate had continued speaking for several seconds without any response before he returned to the conversation. It was nothing. It was so nearly nothing that she would have dismissed it entirely, had she not by that point become very careful about dismissing things that looked like nothing. She set down the glass she was holding with steady hands and thanked God, privately, that the gloves she wore were white enough that the slight pressure she applied to the table's edge did not show. The morning he told her about the letter was a Tuesday in late October, and it was raining, and the conference room at the village inn was lit with such inadequate candlelight that they had both unconsciously moved closer to the single lamp on the desk between them as the afternoon darkened. She had come to bring him the final piece of the document sequence, a ledger page that had been held by her father's old solicitor, and that proved, in the dry arithmetic of accounting, that her jointure payment had in fact been drawn and deposited into an account in her own name in the spring prior to Thomas's death, which meant the claim that no settlement had been made was provably false. The ledger page was a small, dense, water-stained document, and it required interpretation, and they had spent an hour with their heads together over it before she looked up and found him already looking at her from a distance of approximately 12 inches. He did not look away immediately. That was new. "There is a question," he said, "that I have not asked you." "Ask it," she said. "You have pursued this for 2 years, across 6 months of correspondence, a journey to York, 43 documented Thursday morning visits to this office, and at least 1 unauthorized approach to a contested estate's household staff." Something moved in his gray eyes. "Why did you not simply go to your sister in Shropshire?" "Because," she said, "it was mine." He was quiet for a moment. The rain increased against the window. "I had a wife," he said, which was not what she expected. He said it without any particular inflection, the way one states a fact that has been stated before, but that continues to require the periodic act of stating. "She died 3 years ago, in childbirth. My son survived." "I'm sorry," she said. "She wrote me a letter the morning it began," he said. "She wrote it before she sent for the doctor. She was always practical in that way." He looked at the lamp. "I have not read the last 4 lines. I have read the first 2 pages on perhaps 50 occasions. I have not been able to read the last 4 lines." She understood why he was telling her this. She was not entirely sure he understood why he was telling her. "What do you think the last 4 lines say?" she asked. "I think," he said carefully, "that they say something I cannot yet afford to know." She reached into her glove and drew out the mourning ring. It was small and gold, a plain band with a single garnet set flat into the metal, and she placed it on the table between them. "Thomas gave me this on our wedding day," she said. "Lady Dorothea told me it was estate property. She said it had been in the family, and I had no claim to it." She looked at the ring. "I put it in my shoe when I left." He looked at it for a long moment. When he looked up, his eyes were something she had not yet seen in them. Some quality softer than attention, something that had weight to it. "It was always yours," he said. "Yes," she said. It was. If there was something forming between them in that room, it was the kind of thing that forms in the way certain geological changes form, imperceptibly, under pressure, without announcement. She was aware of it with the whole of her body the way one is aware of weather changing. She was also aware that neither of them was yet in a position to name it, and that naming it prematurely would be to mistake an unfired thing for a finished one. So she took the ring back. She did not put it away. She placed it on her right hand, where she had worn it in the weeks immediately after Thomas died, before Lady Dorothea had demanded it. She had not worn it since. She wore it now. If you have followed this story to this point, then you already know this is not the kind of story that travels in a straight line to its resolution. Stay with it. The turn is coming, and it is worth the weight of what precedes it. The forged document surfaced on a Thursday evening at the beginning of November. Lady Dorothea had not been idle during the months of the review. Margaret had known this, had assumed it, and had done her best to proceed on the assumption that the Holt family's resources were being directed against her in ways she could not always see. What she had not anticipated was the specific instrument chosen, a solicitor's letter bearing the date of the week before Thomas Vane's death. purportedly written by his own solicitor, stating that Thomas had verbally retracted the marriage settlement in the presence of witnesses and that the marriage itself had been conducted under conditions that raised questions of legal irregularity. It was not true. It was not even skillfully false. It was, nevertheless, a document, and it bore a seal, and it arrived at his temporary office in Ashby Cross on Thursday at 4 p.m, delivered by the county solicitor who had also delivered to his steward's steward. At the same time, a report that the petitioner, Mrs. Vane, was known to have forged portions of her own marriage register submission. Margaret heard about this from Mrs. Pierce that same evening. The county solicitor had not been discreet. By Friday morning, the substance of the accusation had spread through the village with the swift, comfortable ease of information that confirms what a community had already half decided. It was at the Friday evening gathering at the Alderton House, a modest private assembly at which the same county families arranged themselves around the same topics in the same configuration as at the public rooms, that she heard it for the third time. The steward who attended his office in Ashby Cross's office. In Ashby Cross was there a man named Bellamy who was conscientious and precise, and he was speaking with Mrs. Alderton at the supper table when Margaret passed near enough to hear him say, with the careful phrasing of a man relaying rather than opining, that the petition had become complicated by the emergence of contradictory documentation, and that the petitioner, the one who had been received by no one of weight since her return, had placed the investigation in a difficult position. The petitioner no one received. There it was, the third voicing, neat and bureaucratic and efficient, delivered secondhand as summary of circumstance. Margaret went home that night to the 2 rooms she rented above a stationer's shop in Ashby Cross, and she sat at the small table by the window in the dark for a long time. She was not destroyed by it. She would not permit herself to be destroyed by it. She sat with the full weight of it. The knowledge that Lady Dorothea had understood perfectly well what documents were and what they could be made to do, and that 2 years of careful work could be undone in a Thursday afternoon by a seal applied to a piece of paper by someone practiced at the application. What Margaret also knew, sitting at her dark window while the night deepened outside, was that there was one document Lady Dorothea could not forge, and had not thought to forge, because it was not in a solicitor's office or a county archive or in any of the places that established families think to look when they are deciding which evidence to alter. It was in a vestry at Caldwell Beck, in the keeping of a retired vicar named the Vicar, who was 71 years old, and who had conducted the marriage of the 2 of them and Margaret Harlowe himself, and who had written in his own hand, in the parish register, the names of both witnesses and the date, and the full legal form. He had also, in the margin of that entry, in the small crabbed annotation style of a man accustomed to the historic weight of parish records, noted the unusual condition of the day, that it had been raining, that the hedgerows were in bloom, that the bride had worn a plain white gown, and had held a small gold ring in her closed hand during the reading of the service, and that both parties had spoken their vows with clarity and intention. Reverend Caldwell had retired to his daughter's house in the village of North Skelton, which was 14 miles from Ashby Cross. Margaret rose before dawn on Saturday and hired a horse. The road to North Skelton was not improved. It was a cart track for the better part of its length, and the early November morning was cold enough that her breath rose in visible clouds around her face, and the horse's mane was damp within the first mile. She had written no letter ahead. There had not been time, and she did not trust the post. She arrived at the cottage behind the North Skelton churchyard at 8:30 in the morning, dismounted at the gate, and knocked. The old vicar answered his own door, which suggested he was a man who had not accumulated servants in his retirement, which in turn told her something useful about how he had lived. He was tall and thin and entirely white-haired, with the slow, precise movements of someone who has made peace with the mechanics of advanced age. "Mrs. Vane," he said, which also told her something that he remembered. "Reverend Caldwell," she said, "I need your testimony." She told him what had been done and what was being claimed. He listened without interruption. When she had finished, he asked her 2 questions, both precise, both concerned with dates. She answered them. He nodded. "Come inside," he said, "and have something hot. I'm going to need 20 minutes to write this properly, and you will be cold before we are done." He wrote the testimony in full, in his clear hand, with the register entry referenced by date and page number, and he signed it and sealed it with the stamp he had used as an official of the parish. Then he wrote a second copy. He gave her one. "There is also this," he said, and retrieved from the drawer of his writing desk an envelope that she recognized by the hand. It was Thomas's hand. The envelope was addressed to the vicar, and had been sent to him some months before Thomas's death, and it contained a letter asking the vicar, should it ever become necessary, to confirm the full legitimacy of the marriage and the good character of the woman he had chosen to be his wife. Thomas had anticipated this. He had known his mother, and he had anticipated this, and he had done the one thing available to him. Margaret held the envelope in both hands for a moment. She did not cry because she was 14 miles from Ashby Cross on a cold November Saturday, and she needed to be able to see the road. "He was a decent man," the old man said. "He was," she said. She rode back in 2 hours. She went directly to the village inn and sent word to him. He came that afternoon. She placed the testimony and the letter on the table before him. She did not speak while he read. She sat across from him and watched his face, which changed very little as he read, but changed enough. A tightening around the jaw, a stillness in the eyes that was different from his ordinary stillness. He set the pages down. He looked at her. "This," he said, "is sufficient." "I know," she said. "You rode 14 miles in the dark to obtain it." "The sun had risen by the time I reached the 2nd mile," she said. Something crossed his face so quickly she almost could not name it. "Almost. We go to Holt Park on Monday," he said, "with the relevant authority." He sent word ahead to his superior office in York, who dispatched 2 officers of the Crown's judicial authority, men with the formal standing to serve and execute the examination order, to arrive at Ashby Cross by Sunday evening. Their names were Sergeant Marsh and a younger officer whose name Margaret did not learn because he spoke only in brief confirmatory syllables throughout the proceedings. They arrived on time, and they were competent, and they asked no unnecessary questions. Monday morning was clear and cold, the kind of November morning that burns off early and leaves the air perfectly transparent, so that distances seem shorter than they are and colors seem more decided. The 4 of them went in a carriage to the gates of Holt Park, and there they stopped briefly while the gatekeeper, who had known Margaret when she lived there, opened the gate without being asked, and stood aside with an expression she chose not to read too carefully, because it had too many things in it at once. The drawing room at Holt Park was where they were received, which was Lady Dorothea's choice, a power choice, a room designed to demonstrate occupation and entitlement, a room full of portraits and heavy furniture and the accumulated weight of a family's long confidence in its own permanence. Lady Dorothea stood in its center. The claimant stood at her shoulder. The county solicitor was present, as was a legal representative of the Holt family named Mr. Fenn, who was known to be thorough and who held a leather portfolio under his arm with the comfortable grip of a man who believes he holds the controlling documents. Lady Dorothea looked at Margaret when she entered, and there was only the smallest contraction, a tightening so slight it would have been invisible to anyone who had not spent 2 years studying her expressions. "This visit," Lady Dorothea said, "is most irregular." Sergeant Marsh presented the examination order. He stood at Margaret's right side, not touching her, but close enough that his presence was a fact in the room. Mr. Fenn stepped forward. He opened his portfolio and produced Lady Dorothea's document, the forged solicitor's letter, with the air of a man producing a final authority. He placed it on the writing table. "This," Mr. Fenn said, "represents the Holt family's position, supported by legal instruments that predate the petitioner's claim." Margaret placed his testimony on the table beside it. Then Thomas's letter. Lady Dorothea's eyes moved to the letter. Something happened in them that was very small and very final. "The parish record at Caldwell Beck," he said, his voice the same measured, even instrument it always was, "has been reviewed. The marriage was legally conducted on the 14th of April in 1808. The witnesses are named. The register entry is complete and has not been altered." He looked at Mr. Fenn. "You will also find that the document your client has provided bears a solicitor's seal that was discontinued in 1807, before the firm in question was reconstituted under its current name. The date on that document is therefore inconsistent with the seal used to authenticate it." Silence in the drawing room. The particular silence that descends when the room has understood something before the person at its center has finished understanding it. "Furthermore," he said, "her husband's jointure deposit is documented in a ledger held by his wife's father's solicitor, to whom the original instruction was given in March of 1809. The deposit is confirmed. The settlement is confirmed. The petition is resolved." He turned to Lady Dorothea. "She stands under Crown protection. This estate answers to me." Lady Dorothea opened her mouth, closed it. The fan in her hand, the black chicken skin fan she had carried to every confrontation of this variety for 30 years, the one she held a half-inch too high as though altitude conveyed authority, stilled. Her hand stilled. The portfolio Mr. Fenn held under his arm was very quietly reseated closer to his body. The claimant said, "I think perhaps a further legal review," and Sergeant Marsh said, with the absolute professional calm of a man who has delivered examination orders in rooms precisely like this one, "The order is executed, sir. There is no further review." Lady Dorothea looked at Margaret. The small blue eyes were calculating still, looking for the edge, for the angle, for the place where a woman with her history of winning could still find purchase. There was no edge. There was no angle. Margaret looked back at her without any particular expression, because she had not come here for an expression, and she was not going to provide one now. "You will receive formal correspondence from my office within the week," he said to Mr. Fenn. "I suggest your client engage counsel for the settlement of the estate transfer. It will be uncomplicated if undertaken promptly." They left, the four of them, through the drawing room's double doors, across the hall, and out through the front entrance, and the gatekeeper opened the gate again on their return, and Margaret saw, as she passed, that his expression had simplified considerably. In the carriage, Sergeant Marsh made a brief notation in his report. The young officer confirmed a date. He sat across from her in the carriage and looked out the window at the clear November morning, and she sat across from him and looked at the same window. After some time he said, without looking at her, "You should have had this 2 years ago." "Yes," she said. "The forged seal was poorly chosen," he said. "I had identified it within 4 minutes of examining the document. I needed what you brought from Caldwell Beck in order to act." She understood what he was telling her. That the Viscount had not been slow or uncertain, that he had been waiting for the one piece she had to retrieve herself, that he had known what was needed and had waited for her to provide it. Not because he was withholding, because it had to be hers. "Thank you," she said, "for making that the way of it." He looked at her then, across the carriage, and the November light was coming through the window at a particular angle that found the scar at his temple, and the gray of his eyes, and the controlled compression of his mouth. and none of it was relaxed. None of it was easy. But there was something in it that had not been there at the beginning. She could see through the discipline now, the way one can eventually see through ice on a river to the motion beneath. The estate required some weeks to transfer formally, as such things do. But by December, Margaret had returned to Holt Park as its legal mistress and had opened the windows of the blue sitting room, which smelled of the people who had occupied it without right, and had set about the careful, slow work of making a place that had been taken from her into a place that was, finally, hers in fact, as well as in law. She dismissed no one who had done her no injury. She retained Mrs. Pierce as housekeeper, which required a brief conversation with Mrs. Pierce's sister regarding the library, and which was resolved to everyone's satisfaction by the arrangement that the library remain in its current location, and Mrs. Pierce simply divide her time. He departed without drama. Lady Dorothea departed for her eldest daughter's house in Bath, and she was not cruel in her leaving. She was simply diminished in the particular way of people whose authority has depended on the absence of challenge, who are not destroyed by being corrected, but who are altered. He came to Holt Park in mid-December on an official follow-up visit, which was procedurally necessary and also not entirely necessary, in that it could have been conducted by a deputy, but was conducted by him in person. She received him in the blue sitting room, which by that point no longer smelled of the people who had been there without right. It smelled of the beeswax she had applied to the furniture, and of the fire, and of the cold that came under the sill from the December outside. He sat across from her, and they discussed the procedural matters for approximately 20 minutes, and then the procedural matters were concluded, and they sat for a moment in the particular silence of people who have spoken of nothing else for months, and now have no official language left to use. "I read it," he said. She did not ask what he meant. She knew. "The last 4 lines," he said. "I read them last week." She waited. "She wrote that she was not afraid," he said, "and that she wanted him, our son, to know that his father was a man worth knowing." He looked at the fire, and that she had been glad of it, of all of it, including the difficult parts, that she had been glad. He stopped. 4 lines. She thought of Thomas's letter in the vicar's drawer. She thought of what Thomas had anticipated, quietly, alone, without telling her. "The difficult parts," she said quietly, "are where the gladness often lives." He looked at her then, with the full weight of those gray eyes, and the fire was behind her, and the December cold was at the window, and she was wearing the mourning ring on her right hand, where she had always worn it, and she did not look away. What he said carefully, in the measured even syllables that were the register he used when something mattered, when he was not willing to let inflection carry the work that precision ought to do. He said, "I find that I am not any longer unable to consider what comes after grief." She did not answer immediately. She thought about what 2 years cost, and what they produced, and what it meant to be glad of the difficult parts. The fire crackled. Outside, the first snow of the winter was beginning, very quietly, against the window. "Neither am I," she said. The mourning ring caught the firelight. She had worn it hidden for 2 years, proof held close against her skin in the place where certainty lives when it has nowhere else to go. She wore it now in the open, on her hand, in this room, in this house that was hers, in this life she had rebuilt from the thing they had tried to reduce her to. The snow fell. The fire burned. In the drawer of the writing desk she had reclaimed from the blue sitting room's pretenders, Thomas's letter and the vicar's testimony were folded together in a plain envelope, not for use any longer but for keeping, the way one keeps the documents of things that mattered. He did not leave Holt Park that evening until the fire had burned considerably lower than either of them had originally intended. Outside the window, the snow continued its quiet work on the fields she had come back to claim. She had come back to claim them. She had claimed them. And the morning ring, finally, was home. If Margaret's journey moved you, leave a thought below. Thank you for staying until the end.